The morning it all began seemed like it would be peaceful, the kind of day I had moved out to the lakefront cabin to enjoy. The sun was rising over the still water, casting a shimmering golden reflection that rippled every time a fish jumped. The air was cool, clean, and carried that sweet earthy scent of pine mixed with dew. My grandfather always used to say mornings like that were the reason we fight to keep this land, and I thought about him as I walked down to check the fence near the gravel drive. This land wasn't just property to me. It was heritage, legacy, and the place where my best childhood memories lived. My grandfather had built the cabin himself decades earlier, hammer by hammer, log by log. Every board creaked with history, every corner held his presence. He was a stubborn man, one who believed fiercely in independence and the right to live without anyone else's thumb pressing down. Before he passed, he made me promise never to sell the land, never to hand it over to outside control. It wasn't just soil and timber, it was freedom. So you can imagine my surprise when that so-called freedom was suddenly challenged by a woman I had never seen before. I heard her before I saw her, footsteps crunching on the gravel, brisk and impatient, almost as if she was marching into battle. When she finally appeared, I had to blink twice. She wore a neon safety vest, like she was directing traffic, held a clipboard stacked with papers, and wore a permanent scowl etched into her face as though smiling had been outlawed. Without a hello, without so much as eye contact, she shoved the clipboard at me like it was a weapon. "You're required to join the HOA," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Your dues are late. Sign here." I looked down at the papers, bewildered. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "I'm not part of an HOA." She rolled her eyes so hard it was a wonder they didn't fall out of her head. "Don't play games with me. All the properties in this community are under the association. You've been ignoring the notices, and frankly, that ends today." For a moment, I genuinely thought this had to be some kind of scam. I had lived here long enough to know where the HOA boundary lines ended, and my property wasn't part of it. This land had been in my family for decades, long before the first suburban cookie-cutter homes popped up across the ridge. I never signed anything, never attended a meeting, never agreed to their rules. Yet, here was this woman, Karen, as I'd later learn, insisting that I owed money to a group I had no connection to. I flipped through the packet. It was filled with jargon about community compliance, architectural approval, and monthly dues. I saw fine print about penalties for unauthorized paint colors and non-standard mailbox designs. It was laughable. My cabin was hand-built, rustic, designed to blend into the forest, not stand out in some picture-perfect subdivision. None of these rules applied to me. I handed the papers back and said, "This is my private property. I own the land free and clear. I'm not a member of your HOA." Karen's lips curled into a tight, thin smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Everyone in this area must comply. You don't get to freeload while the rest of us pay dues. If you don't sign, I'll fine you. And believe me, the HOA always wins." There it was, the tone, that shrill, condescending certainty of someone who thought they had all the power in the world. She stood there like a self-appointed queen, ruling over subjects who hadn't asked to be ruled. I could see the fire in her eyes. This wasn't about fairness or community, this was about power. Karen was the type of person who lived for control, for dictating how others lived, what they wore, how they decorated their homes, even how tall their grass could grow. The HOA wasn't just a group of homeowners, it was her kingdom. And in her mind, I was just another subject who needed to bow. But here's what she didn't know, what made this entire confrontation almost amusing. The very house Karen lived in, the place from which she launched her crusades, technically, wasn't even hers. Decades earlier, when my grandfather sold a portion of his land to developers, he inserted a reversion clause into the deed. If certain financial obligations weren't met, ownership of the lots could revert back to our family. Over the years, through missed payments, legal oversights, and complicated transfers, many of those clauses had quietly gone into effect. On the paper, it meant I had partial ownership stakes in several HOA homes, including Karen's. Of course, I didn't reveal this to her that day. I wasn't about to tip my hand while she was standing there spewing threats. Instead, I let her rant. She promised fines, legal trouble, even liens against my property. She stormed off, stomping down my driveway like she had just conquered new territory. I watched her go, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. As her neon vest disappeared down the road, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. The arrogance was astounding. She thought she was untouchable, thought the HOA was an unstoppable force that could bend everyone to its will. But she had no idea that she was standing on very shaky ground, literally. Because while she believed she had the power to dictate my life, the truth was the opposite. She lived in my house. That was the moment I made my decision. I wasn't going to just ignore Karen. I wasn't going to crumple up the letters or laugh off her threats. No, this was personal now. She had barged onto my land, disrespected my family's legacy, and tried to bully me into submission. She wanted a fight, and I was going to give her one, not through shouting matches or childish arguments, not through petty back and forth, but through something far more effective, the truth. The kind of truth that knocks the crown right off a self-proclaimed queen's head. The days following Karen's uninvited visit were strangely quiet, but I knew it wouldn't last. People like her never back down after one confrontation. They thrive on conflict, it fuels them like oxygen. Sure enough, by the end of the week, I started finding violation notices taped to my mailbox. The first one accused me of having non-standard fencing. The second claimed my outdoor paint color was unapproved. Another went so far as to fine me for unauthorized landscaping. Each notice was more ridiculous than the last. My property wasn't even part of their HOA, yet she kept escalating, drowning me in paper threats. I'd be lying if I said it didn't bother me. Every time I peeled another notice off my mailbox, I felt a sting of anger. My grandfather would have hated this. The idea of some self-appointed authority trampling over independence, trying to control every aspect of how a person lived. And yet I also felt something else building inside me. Determination. Because Karen had no idea that with every threat she made, she was digging her own grave. I pulled out the old deed records my grandfather had kept. They were stored in a weathered lockbox, yellowed papers stacked neatly, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. I traced my fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins where he'd scrawled reminders about land deals, clauses, and conditions. And there it was, plain as day, the reversion clause that tied Karen's home directly back to my family. Legally, it was airtight. Financial mismanagement within the HOA had triggered the clause years ago, which meant the land beneath Karen's house and the house itself was technically mine. She was, in the simplest terms, my tenant. The irony was too rich to ignore. The woman who stormed onto my property, waving her clipboard and barking orders, was living under my roof whether she realized it or not. I decided the reveal had to be timed perfectly. Too soon, and she might weasel her way into some kind of legal loophole. Too late, and she'd cause even more chaos in the neighborhood. No, the moment had to be public, undeniable, and humiliating enough to strip away the illusion of power she clung to. That moment came at the monthly HOA meeting. I'd never been to one before. They held them in a bland community center, fluorescent, lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs lined up in neat rows. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink. I sat in the back, unnoticed at first, while Karen strutted around at the front like she was royalty preparing for coronation. She banged a cheap wooden gavel against the table and began the meeting with all the pomp of a judge delivering a verdict. First order of business, she declared loudly, is addressing the ongoing non-compliance of the cabin property at the edge of our community. This individual continues to disregard our rules and refuses to pay dues. I'm moving that we authorize legal action to seize assets if necessary. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some neighbors nodded reluctantly, clearly too afraid of her, wrath to disagree. Others looked confused, unsure how she could enforce rules on land they knew was never under HOA jurisdiction. But Karen bulldozed over their hesitation, launching into a tirade about standards and order and how I was threatening the very fabric of their community. That's when I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but carrying enough weight to cut through her speech. "Before you make any motions regarding my property, Perhaps we should clarify a few things. Karen froze. Her eyes narrowed into slits, and she gave me a look that could curdle milk. You don't belong here. This is an HOA meeting, members only. Oh, I belong here more than you think, I replied, pulling a folder from under my arm. I walked to the front, every step deliberate, and laid the deed papers on the table in front of her. You see, Karen, the property you're talking about isn't under your HOA's control. It never was. In fact, the house you live in, the one you so proudly defend as part of this community, actually belongs to me. For a split second, silence filled the room. Then laughter broke out from the back, hesitant at first but growing louder, as neighbors realized I wasn't joking. Karen snatched up the papers, her hands trembling as she scanned the highlighted clauses, the legal signatures, the dates that predated her reign of terror. This is fraudulent, she sputtered, her face turning crimson. This doesn't mean you can't own— Oh, but I do, I interrupted firmly. Every threat you've made, every violation notice you've taped to my mailbox, every fine you've tried to impose, it's meaningless. Because at the end of the day, you're not in charge of me. You're my tenant. And you've been living rent-free on my land for years. Gasps filled the room. Some people looked shocked. Others looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. A few even smiled, clearly savoring the delicious irony of their self-proclaimed queen being toppled in real time. Karen, however, was unraveling. Her composure shattered as she flipped through the pages again and again, desperately searching for some way to discredit the truth staring her in the face. But the truth doesn't bend, and her power evaporated with every passing second. Can't do this, she finally shrieked. The HOA will fight you. Go ahead, I said evenly. File whatever lawsuits you want. Every judge in the county will laugh you out of the courtroom when they see these documents. And when the dust settles, Karen, you'll realize what everyone else already knows. You're not above the law and you're not above me. The room erupted, not with applause, but with something better. Murmurs of agreement, nods of solidarity. Neighbors openly defying her for the first time. Someone even whispered finally under their breath. For years, Karen had ruled through fear and intimidation, but fear only works when people believe you're untouchable. That illusion had been shattered in one night. I gathered my papers, tucked them back into the folder, and gave Karen one last look. Not of anger, not even of victory, just finality. This ends now, I told her quietly.